My response to Putin's remark, as to earlier threats involving nuclear weapons, is to say to him privately and publicly, if Russia uses a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin has signed his personal death warrant.
President Biden will host Keir Starmer in Washington tomorrow for a series of talks focusing on Western support for Ukraine. The White House has said, or Times sources understand this evening, that the United States may allow Ukraine to use British and French missiles, but not its own long-range weapons inside Russia. So yes to Western weapons, yes to British and French missiles, but none originating from the United States. The overall use of Western weapons in Russia by Ukraine is something that President Zelensky has been calling for some time. He says Ukraine can't prevail without them. Here's Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, speaking to Polish media today.
Time and again, the Ukrainian people, supported by an extraordinary coalition of more than 50 countries, have demonstrated that they have the will and, if we sustain it, and we will, the capacity to succeed. So I have no doubt about that.
Let's speak to Ambassador John Bolton now, former US Ambassador to the UN and former National Security Advisor. Good evening to you.
Good evening. Glad to be with you.
Ambassador Bolton, tell me what you make of what the Times has been hearing this evening from sources of two different governments, so the governments of two different nations. That is that the United States may allow Ukraine to use French and British missiles to attack inside Russia, but won't allow it to use its own longer range weapons. What do you make of that?
Well, that sounds consistent with the Biden administration's totally non-strategic approach after 2.5 years to aiding Ukraine. It's a policy that reflects the U.S. and NATO, therefore, being deterred by Russia consistently by this threat of a wider war that Russia is not capable of waging. So even though we failed to deter the Russian attack in February of 2022, the Russians have deterred us from aiding Ukraine in a careful, systematic, strategic fashion that could have this war in a very different place than it is now.
So look, the Americans fear escalation is the moot point here.
Okay, well, let's take that point. On the conventional side, where is the Russian army that's going to fight a wider war? And by the way, if they've got an army that can do that, why isn't it in Ukraine now, making up for their pitiful performance over the past 2.5 years? I don't think Putin has the capability. Over a year and a half ago, the Biden Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, said the Russians were feeding their army into a wood chipper, and it's just continued since then. Second, on the threat of a potential use of nuclear weapons, we've had testimony in open session of Congress from the intelligence community that said whenever Putin has rattled the nuclear saber, there's been zero evidence that any nuclear forces have redeployed or moved into a higher state of alert. I think Putin's been bluffing, and we've fallen for the bluff.
Well, just this afternoon, Vladimir Putin has said lifting Ukraine missile restrictions would put NATO at war with Russia. So that is his warning this afternoon. It's hardly surprising. I mean, it's taken a bit of time for him to say it in this particular round of discussions. Obviously, we've been, running this story, following this story very closely for around a week now. John, look.
Well, can I address that, because this is an important point?
Go on.
If you're worried about what Putin said, then we react accordingly, you're going to give him what he wants. At absolutely no cost to him. My response to Putin's remark, as to earlier threats involving nuclear weapons, is to say to him privately and publicly, if Russia uses a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin has signed his personal death warrant. Hopefully that will have a deterrent effect.
What should the United States do? Should they allow the use of long-range missiles, US long-range missiles? Should they allow their use by Ukraine inside Russian territory? And should they go further still?
Well, I think there's a lot of things we could do further and should have done further much earlier in the war. I think it's reasonable to have some U.S. and NATO control over weapons that could implicate Russia in a larger struggle, particularly if they're aimed well behind the current lines and the current theater of operations. But Ukraine has already done a substantial amount without a Russian response. For example, a significant portion of the Russian Black Sea fleet now lies at the bottom of the Black Sea, and there's been no Russian retaliation. I think there are other things we could do, such as collapsing the Kerch Strait Bridge entirely, which would cut off a major Russia resupply route into the Kremlin. Look, it's the position of every NATO member that we favor the full restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now, do we mean that or do we not mean that?
Look, to pick you up on an earlier point, Putin doesn't have the capability to follow out his threats. It's not going well for Russia in this war at the moment, yet they've just taken delivery of a bunch of long-range missiles from Iran. Surely via their associates, via their relationships with Iran, China and beyond, surely we'd be naive to think that they don't have the capability to escalate this war significantly.
And we have the capability to obliterate them if they do. If you don't believe in deterrence, if you're frightened by everything your adversary does, why bother to have a military in the first place? It is a fact that there is a growing Chinese-Russia axis with outliers like North Korea, which is also supplying Russia, like Iran, which is supplying Russia, like Syria, like Belarus, like Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. We're still adjusting in the United States. Many people do not appreciate the full nature of this threat. I think it's even more acute in Europe, not understanding the threat posed by China. We're living in an increasingly dangerous world, and we have to adjust to it. But one principle that NATO has always stood for, when NATO members are threatened, Ukraine obviously not a NATO member, but as the victim twice now in the last 10 years of unprovoked aggression, if NATO doesn't defeat that aggression, our adversaries all around the world will draw the appropriate conclusion.
One final one for you is what you made of what Donald Trump had to say about Ukraine in that US presidential debate, him and Kamala Harris, the other night. He called for an end to the war. He didn't say Ukraine should win the war, that the US should support Ukraine to win the war. He just said he wanted an end to the war. That was notable. What did you make of it?
Well, he was directly asked twice if he wouldn't say he favored Ukraine winning the war, which, as you rightly say, he declined to do. I think that tells everybody all they need to know about how Trump approaches this. He said he'd get Zelensky and Putin in a room together and they'd resolve it in 24 hours. That's obviously ridiculous. Somebody will be to blame for that failure. It won't be Donald Trump. Probably be Zelensky, and Putin and Trump will resolve the war to Russia's satisfaction. That's what's coming if he wins.
Look, really good to speak to you. Thank you. Ambassador John Bolton, a former US ambassador to the UN and former national security advisor. Thanks for being with us on Times Radio.